So another important idea is the idea of patriotism and nationalism and jingoism. So, and this, of course, is rolled in to the idea of nation states. Patriotism is just sort of the, having pride in your country and being loyal or love your country. Straightforward, sort of a simple idea. I think of myself as a patriot. I'm, not ashamed to be an American. I also recognize there are problems in our country. We have not always done the right thing. We have done bad things. And in a lot of ways, we need to do better, But patriotism is just, loving who you are, loving where you come from, supporting your country to some degree. Nationalism, a lot of people who believe they're patriots are actually nationalists. And nationalists is that sort of ratcheted up patriotism that gets blinded by love of country to the detriment of others. So I think it's natural that you tend to put your country first, but there's a need to understand when that might affect others, even within your own country. So nationalism is sort of this blind patriotism, and usually tied with that is this idea of exceptionalism, right? So the way we do things is the best way, and that's all there is to it. I think I need to back up here. No, we're on the wrong slide. We'll get to that in a minute. So then there's jingoism, which is ratcheted up nationalism that's very belligerent and hostile towards other nations. So it's already the idea of love of country and the ideas and everything, but towards the rest of the world, you're very hostile. At certain points, you could say that there's a lot of different countries that have fallen into jingoism. I think the best examples right now would be a state like North Korea, who has a very closed society. They have a lot of propaganda that comes out of North Korea about, how, they're the greatest people and all this stuff. Although what little glimpses we get to see inside North Korea, we know that's not the case. Russia would be another example, where their military and this idea of power and hostility sort of leads their diplomacy. Well, I don't guess it's diplomacy, but it leads their foreign policy. And we're seeing that with what's happening in Ukraine right now, the war there. So very hostile and belligerent sort of idea of nationalism. So thinking about nationalism here and how we got to World War I. Well, your great powers of Europe all had very strong senses of nationalism at before the war started. Britain loved Britain. Britons loved Britain. The British people, they felt that they did things better than anybody else. Same thing with Germany, France. It wasn't exclusive to any one group. Neil, I'm sorry. Yeah, hostile is unfriendly, really, and very almost violent, to the point of violence. And this was going around Europe at the time. The other problem, as we've sort of introduced here along the way, is that these were many of these were colonial empires. They had taken the world for themselves, so to speak. Great Britain, still the biggest world power at the time, really controlled the seas with their navies, controlled trade, and there were certainly plenty of other countries behind them, not far behind them. France still had lots of territory. Also, Germany was a fairly new state that had unified in the 1800s. They had been a lot of little separate kingdoms that had finally come together. They wanted to become a colonial power and started colonizing parts of Africa. They had a fairly violent history with colonialism. Belgium, little tiny Belgium, also was a colonial power at this time, and by far the worst as far as their treatment of the indigenous people in the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo. I mean, brutal. Their treatment of people was so bad that the rest of the colonial powers looked at Belgium and was like, man, you need to chill. The rest of Europe was coming down on them for the harsh treatment. I mean, it was really just bad. Dismemberment of people for punishment. They would chop off hands and stuff like this. It was really, really ugly. But anyway, so there's this economic competition that's going on in Europe that's attached to the nationalism. We got to be better than Germany. We have to be better than France. And it's driving this nationalism. And alongside that is this militarism that's going on. So there's this love of sort of the military, this reverence for all things military in a lot of these nations as well. This is the dawn of the Boy Scouts, which has their roots in sort of this idea of instilling discipline in young boys, giving them those sort of survival skills and things like that. So it really reaches very far and wide into these countries. So it's really just a lot of tension in Europe in the early 1900s leading up to 1914. So what happens to sort of the trigger for World War I? It does not, a lot of people sort of point to this as the cause, but I'll get to that in a second. The other issue here is that there's these alliances that have formed in Europe and Russia. There's the Triple Entente, which is Great Britain, France, and Russia, that are all aligned, and they basically have a pact. It's like, hey, if somebody comes, causing you trouble, we will help you, right? So France, Great Britain, and Russia, they're all aligned together. And then I think I have that right. I don't think that's backwards. The Triple Alliance. Why that feels wrong all of a sudden. No, that's right. Triple Alliance was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So they're all aligned. So Austria-Hungary is sort of its own empire that's combined at this time. Same kind of idea. If somebody comes giving you trouble, we will throw in with your lot and help. So and of course this is happening because there's all these tension between these countries. Whether it's economic competition, political competition, ideological competition. And then there's the moment that's going to bring everybody to war. And that's the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. He was basically the prince of the country. His father was the ruler of that empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's assassinated in Sarajevo by a Bosnian Serb. And the whole thing was this fiasco. I mean, there was like this chase and all this stuff was going on, and they got away for a little bit, and then they wind up coming back. It was just this whole ruckus for the day. But Franz Ferdinand is killed in Bosnia. The other thing that's happening here is Russia is aligned with Bosnia. So the Austrian-Hungarian Empire is going to go to war with Bosnia there because of this assassination. And Russia throws in with Bosnia. And that then pulls in Great Britain and France. And then because Russia is going to side with Bosnia, and Austria-Hungary has a alliance with Germany and Italy, and Turkey eventually will get pulled in as well to this war. So that's all it took. If it wasn't the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, something would have happened to bring war. There was very little chance that things were going to be reversed, that these tensions would be relieved. Something probably would have ignited this war. And this is why people get really nervous when world leaders start throwing around words like nationalism. Donald Trump does not understand history, and he did not understand why people don't like the word nationalism. And there was multiple times where he would run around in his little, campaigns or rallies or whatever, and he would say, "I don't understand what's wrong. Why does everybody get upset? What's wrong with being a nationalist?" Apparently, he's never heard of World War I. Patriotism, fine. Nationalism, you're starting to have an issue. So, the thing is now, so the rest of the summer was kind of chill in Europe. They didn't immediately go to war, but it was coming after this death, the death of Franz Ferdinand. So at the end of the summer, the troops start mustering and war is coming. And everybody was happy because this was the mindset of a lot of Europeans at the time, not all, but certainly a fair number were rooting for Europe to go to war. Part of the reason they thought this way was they thought it was going to be a short war. They, Europeans, people in Britain, people in France, thought we'll go to war and we'll be home by Christmas of 1914. We'll have a couple campaigns, a few little battles. We'll, settle this up. It'll be over. Well, that's not the case at all. And this really is, where I mentioned Civil War was sort of the last pre-modern war and the first modern war. World War I is certainly the ideas there are certainly modern war, and we see a lot of the technology that has evolved but is used today. Trench warfare was, by and large, one of the biggest tactics used because of the invention of things like the machine gun, the use of barbed wire, the use of artillery. I mentioned, during the Civil War, we had these rifled barrels in these guns now that would make bullets a lot more stable and a lot more accurate. It gave them a lot more distance. So like about 300 yards, you could accurately hit a target with like a Springfield rifle. And that was a muzzle loader. You had to pour the powder in and you put the ball in and you jammed it down and then you pulled the flintlock back and you shot. By the end of the Civil War, you started having what they called, cartridges. So, and you had repeating rifles. So you had like a more modern, bullet with a cartridge that was going into use during the Civil War. Between 1860s and 1914, that technology is continuing to evolve to the point where we get the machine gun by World War I. So the amount of firepower that two men could put on a battlefield was more so than a company of Civil War soldiers. And the result was you had this space between the trenches where you would die if you put your head up or you got out of a trench, because you would get sprayed with bullets. There was barbed wire that was impassable, so you get caught up in that. You get mowed down by fire. And that's where we get this term no man's land, because that area just no one could occupy between the trenches of France and Germany, or Great Britain and Germany. Just overwhelming and deadly what war has become now. And there was also a widespread use of chemical weapons, things like mustard gas, which is ammonia and bleach, basically, that would just burn your eyes and your your respiratory system, and if you got enough of it, you weren't going to survive. After World War I, there's a lot of attempts to prevent the use of those. And the use of most of those weapons today would be considered a war crime because they're so just brutal. And the way, the effects on the human body are just more than, what we will tolerate, even from an enemy. So there's also the idea of, which I mentioned, sort of taking the war to the people. See if I can get my slides to advance. There we go. And just generally, the devastation and death in World War I is why they, at the time, called it the war to end all wars. And this global war, because they thought there's certainly just couldn't happen again. The devastation and the toll on Europe. We also see aircraft used. They've been used in other conflicts, leading up to World War I, but really widespread use of aircraft and sort of understanding the role they're going to play in warfare from that time on by bombing and things like that. But this is a European war largely for the first 3 years. The United States does not get involved. I mentioned we were largely isolationists. We didn't get involved with the affairs of Europe or other countries really, unless it had something to do with us. We got involved with the revolution in Cuba that was going on at the end of the 1800s, largely because that was in our backyard. And I mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, that we're not going to have these other powers come messing around in our hemisphere or in our backyard. That's really was part of that. But other than that, we didn't run across the ocean setting up colonies in faraway lands. I did mention that can we call ourselves a colonial empire because of the Philippines and some other holdings that we have along the way. But we were largely just concerned about us and making sure that we were okay. Woodrow Wilson, who was elected his first 4 years in 1913, was president through World War I. He campaigned for his second reelection that he was going to keep us out of the war. That was part of his agenda. That was part of his campaign, was keeping us out of the war. There were several things that happened that the United States could not ignore that was going to get us to war, that we were going to have to throw in our lot in World War I. There was this unrestricted submarine warfare that was conducted by Germany at the time that was torpedoing ships that were crossing the Atlantic. Some of those were commercial ships. The Lusitania was a passenger liner that was sunk. It was a British liner, but it had Americans aboard, and they were killed after this attack. Germany went after these boats because they claimed that they were sending over good military goods. Even though we were basically neutral, we did start sending military goods to France and Great Britain. And there were guns actually on the Lusitania. Nevertheless, it was a civilian ship, and that started to outrage Americans that this was, continuing. So this submarine warfare that was going on in the Atlantic was starting to really tick us off. Another really interesting event that got us closer to entering the war was this Zimmermann telegram. So Zimmermann was a diplomat in Germany. He was one of the higher officials, like I don't think it was as high as like the Secretary of State, but he was a major name in sort of foreign affairs in Germany. He sends a telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico that if the United States looks like they're going to enter the war, he needs to approach the Mexican government and tell the Mexican government that if Mexico invades the United States to reclaim the territory that they had ceded to them in previous wars. So like I mentioned the Mexican-American War, where we basically get Texas and part of New Mexico, Arizona. Germany will help them with military aid and financial aid supporting a Mexican war against the United States to, keep the United States out of Europe. If they, have to wind up fighting a war with Mexico, then that would keep them out. That would help Germany, maybe secure a victory. So this telegram, though, there's a problem. At the time, to send a telegram from anywhere in Europe, basically, to the United States, it traveled along a cable that had been laid on the bottom of the ocean. I don't remember exactly what year this was, but it was, fairly early on after the invention of the telegraph, and after of course across our nation we already had like telegraph lines and everything during the Civil War. So sometime between say the end of the Civil War into the early 1900s, this cable was laid out across the ocean. That cable and the communications on either side were owned by the United States and Great Britain. So Germany was trying to transmit a secret letter to the ambassador of Germany in Mexico that Mexico should invade the United States on a telegraph line owned by Great Britain. So the message was intercepted. Great Britain was like, hey, you should look at this, United States. And that was another, sort of reason that we got pulled into World War I, because obviously Germany was starting to act very hostile towards the United States. And basically, the United States entering the war as late as it did is what tipped the balance for the Triple Entente, the France and Great Britain, because Russia winds up exiting the war shortly after the U.S. enters it because of their own domestic issues. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, this is when the communists take power. They overthrow the emperor of Russia and install a communist government led by Vladimir Lenin. We'll talk a little bit more about the new sort of Soviet Union when we get to the Cold War. But because of their own domestic problems and Lenin wanting to exit the war, they drop out. So it's a good thing that the United States came along. That tips the balance towards the Triple Entente, and Great Britain, France, the United States becomes the victor. Italy actually switches sides at one point and becomes an ally to Great Britain and the United States. I mean, their effort there was sort of marginal, but they were a new ally where they had been originally aligned with Germany and Austria-Hungary. So the influx of U.S. troops helps win the war. It is devastating. We're talking 23 and a half, maybe close to 24 million deaths is estimated over the course of those about 4 years. Or 3 years. No, about 4. 8 million combat deaths. So actually soldiers dying in combat. Remember I told you during the Civil War, disease was one of the biggest killers. Same thing here for soldiers. Conditions inside a trench were awful. That's where we get the idea of trench foot, because these soldiers a lot of times would just have wet feet for so long, they would get bacteria starting to build up and get sores, and it was just awful conditions. And the war spreads to civilians more so, not necessarily death from military action, although there were over 2 million civilians killed by opposing militaries, right? Just put to death. And at this time, we're also having an issue with the Spanish flu, which was the last sort of great pandemic before COVID. There was a lot of referencing the Spanish flu during sort of the height of COVID, as far as like what kind of policies they had and how they were fighting it, how it affected the population. A lot of that was perpetuated or made worse because of the malnutrition that was caused because people couldn't get food during the war. So it was a horrible time in Europe during the war. And we really had, this. The other thing with modern war that's changed is now that we have a very high civilian death toll, whether it's because of disease or whether it's because of military action. And that's something fairly new in war as well. There's certainly times you can pick out, these raids or things like that where there's been civilian deaths, but where civilians really become a target for war, that's fairly new. And I mentioned, with the Civil War, like William Sherman had, burned cities. He wasn't killing civilians, but he was trying to demoralize the population, not targeting them for death, but destroying cities and farms and things like that, trying to undermine the Southern war effort. So with the United States entering the war there for about a year, we have an armistice. We have a treaty basically that's signed on November 11th, 1918 to end the war. And then there's the Paris Peace Conference that comes after that, and the Treaty of Versailles. So an armistice is basically sort of like a ceasefire while the two sides can negotiate. And when you actually have a peace treaty, that's when you actually agree on terms to end the war. The Korean War, for example, is still under an armistice. Technically, the Korean War has never ended, which might be why we have some tension between North and South, because there's never been any final resolutions. The Paris Peace Conference, however, had its own issues, and it's going to come back to bite Europe in the butt about not quite about 20 some years later, not even quite 20 years later. The problem is the way they go after Germany for causing the war. Germany gets most of the blame for World War I. Now, I just mentioned there's all this nationalism that's going around Europe. There's all these alliances that are forming. And Germany didn't assassinate Franz Ferdinand. But at the end of the day, Germany gets blamed. And it demoralizes Germany, it embarrasses Germany, and it makes them go broke because they have to pay this restitution. They have to pay for the war. They are demilitarized. They're not allowed to have a standing military. They have to give up land. They have to give up their colonies. So just really stripping Germany of its sort of world status. And again, it's a huge embarrassment, and they go broke as well. And we'll see when we get down the road how that works out for Europe. So blame Germany is really one of the big ideas there. So that's how World War I ends. And I want to just briefly mention Woodrow Wilson, who was the president during that time. So another reason that we got involved in World War I is so we could have a say in what the peace and the world order would be like when the war was over. And that was something that Woodrow Wilson also understood. So as much as he tried to keep us out of the war, he knew at some point that for us to maybe help prevent that from happening again, we need to be involved. We got to have a stake in the game, right? So he has these 14 points that he issues about what the world order should look like in the wake of World War I. And a few of the main ideas out of that 14 points was, equality of trade and freedom of navigation of the seas. Of course, that's informed and influenced by the submarine warfare. So he wants to avoid, this continuation of interference on the seas. And sort of freedom of trade between people. Self-determination. So really pushing forth this idea that these people who have lost their sovereignty due to colonialism, who are under the rule of others, should be autonomous, should be able to rule themselves. So that's one of the ideas as well. He also mentions in the 14 points not to come down so hard on Germany, which is exactly what happened, though. So this is often referenced as well as sort of one of the doctrines of the United States as far as like these ideas that we follow. That sort of guide us. It's not a governing document, but we point towards the 14 points for sort of ideas that we hold sort of special, particularly when it comes to the autonomy of other people. And we could have a whole class, we could have a whole semester about how we might fail at that. And then one of the other points was to create an association of nations where the conflicts between the world could be resolved, to have some type of body that would be able to resolve issues to prevent this from happening again. So what we do get out of that is the League of Nations that's created in January 1920. But the United States isn't involved. It's really the idea of Woodrow Wilson, but politicians at home did not like the idea of the League of Nations, did not like the United States to continue to be involved in world affairs. So the United States does, again, become an isolationist sort of country, not so much worried about what's going on in Europe after World War I, after the initial issues are resolved. So the United States does not participate, probably hurting the idea of the League of Nations overall. It's the predecessor to the United Nations that we have today, but of course, it has very little power. It can't enforce much, but it is a forum where people can make people aware of world issues, bring attention to things. And it never looks good when the UN, or at that time League of Nations, sort of comes down on you for some type of atrocity or crisis that's happening. Woodrow Wilson, at the end, just to mention a little domestic sort of history here, had a stroke towards the end of his presidency. Likely the last months of his presidency, he was not really governing. His wife was probably sort of directing things along with his staff. And he died in 1924, I believe. Yeah, so about 2 years after he left office. So that's how the first 2 decades of the 20th century start off, with a global war, with the world powers of Europe at war and millions of deaths. The United States comes out of that looking pretty darn good, because for one, we were a creditor nation at the time, because we were leasing goods and selling goods to mostly France and Britain at the time. Our economy coming out of that era was really good. We did suffer from, a lot of deaths from the Spanish flu that, reached us. So there was a couple seasons there where that was an issue. And that was, like I said, the last big global pandemic. And that's a lot of your epidemiologists, people that study epidemics, other sort of virologists and stuff says, about every century, we have, an issue. There's going to be, sort of, if we look back, 100 years before that, and we keep going, we'll see these sort of big outbreaks of a disease. And so we were kind of due when we get to COVID. So let's see here. I at least get to women's suffrage. We might not get all the way through the 1920s, but I at least want to talk about women's suffrage because we've actually talked about it a little bit in social studies with some of the documents we looked at. We've talked about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who were some of the original activists for women's suffrage. So suffrage is basically the right to vote. Okay, and you might mention, I mentioned, I believe it was the 15th Amendment, which ensured the right to vote, no matter race, creed, religion, right? That applied to that came out of the era of Reconstruction to prevent recently freed slaves, freedmen, African Americans living in the South, guarantee making sure they have the right to vote. That only applied to men. So the 15th Amendment did not have a gender aspect to it. But the women's suffrage movement starts well before that. Before the Civil War even, in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention in New York is where Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott had come together to talk about women's rights, and had this document they issued. I think it was at this time, I think it was called the Bill of Rights for Women. It was something along those lines. I'm getting a little fuzzy on when that was issued, if it was issued actually during the Seneca Falls Convention. But the ideas coming out of that convention were that women basically were people too. And it took a convention, and it took until 1848 for people to start to understand that women are autonomous individuals. They share the same rights as any men. The Bill of Rights should apply to women the same way it does to, or the Constitution should apply to women the same way it does to men. That was largely what was kind of going on at the convention. Not surprisingly, the women's suffrage movement was greatly tied to anti-slavery and abolition. These women were, activists and felt that the oppression and slavery that was going on in the South sort of paralleled what women were experiencing as far as their civil rights. So they were intertwined. They were really intertwined. A lot of these women worked as, in the abolitionist movement. Susan B. Anthony starts the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869. She is arrested at some point for trying to vote in a federal election. I think it was maybe a presidential election. And as you can see, from 1848, it took until 1920, with the 19th Amendment ratified by 3/4 of the state in 1920, August 18th, 1920, women finally receive the right to vote federally. Now, this is again what I'm talking about with sovereignty and primacy. Some states had already made that legal, had already given women their suffrage, the right to vote. which is represented in this political cartoon here. So we've seen a few political cartoons sort of early on. We looked at a few. This one is basically, you have your women there who are representing the women activists of the suffrage movement, and they're steamrolling the oppression there. And if you look close, I think it has equal suffrage, the banners that the women are wearing, and the one in the middle is the West. A lot of the Western states had already legalized and gave women the right to vote. So, that's sort of, moving that progress towards through the rest of the country. Utah, as a matter of fact, I think was one of the first states, if not the first state, to give women the right to vote. But it also, the other sort of sad thing about the women's suffrage movement is that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton died before they ever got the opportunity to vote in a federal election. They actually passed away before the 19th Amendment was ratified. So they did not get to see the fruits of their labor and see that movement completed. But I suppose we do have a little more time here. So we'll go ahead and see how far we get into the 1920s. The 1920s is a really happening time. That's why they're called the Roaring 20s. So right at the beginning, we have this, women are securing the right to vote. There's these cultural movements. There's a lot of economic prosperity. And there's a bit of a technological revolution, a lot of stuff that's occurring in the 20s. Coming out of, for the United States, there's, obviously the economy is good because of our sort of creditor status around the world. There's other technology that's coming along here. The mass production of automobiles. So, early 1900s, the automobile was sort of a hobbyist thing, sort of a rich, eccentric purchase to own an automobile, thanks to Henry Ford, who perfects the assembly line. So it's no longer where you have to have a craftsman see, whatever the product is from beginning to end. You now have this work segmented. So, in building a car, somebody assembles part of the frame, somebody puts the wheels on, somebody puts the steering wheel on, you have this whole line that allows for mass production of automobiles. Well, when supply goes up, right, prices go down. So the automobile becomes more affordable for more people, and it makes Americans more mobile. So mass production of automobiles occurs in the 1920s. Talkies, so movies now have sound. So that's a revolution. And cinema, you have this early age of cinema, a revolution there. Golden age of radio. So we talked about sort of radio signals when it came to the wireless telegraph, right? So after we figured out how to make wireless transmissions of tones in telegraphs, the next step was to make just carry sound, carry actual words and songs. So radio becomes a really popular item in the U.S. And just like today, as we watch TV, there was appointment radio, so people would gather around the radios at 7 o'clock at night or whenever to listen to this sort of teleplay that would be performed. And there's a ton of those. As I mentioned, aviation is growing after sort of its some of the successes in World War I. It becomes more of a less, again, like the automobile, less of a frivolous sort of rich guy's hobby, and you have more investment in creating commercial airlines. Charles Lindbergh completes the first voyage across the Atlantic nonstop in an aircraft from New York to Paris, I believe. And it's really showing the viability of this for transportation. So there's great leaps and bounds made in aviation technology at the time. And then we started to see television. It's not widespread, but being able to transmit images, moving images onto a screen is becoming available. It won't be until after World War II where that becomes sort of a common item in households, at least in American households. It's invented initially in Britain, I believe. So some other advancements. Penicillin does not really become available until the 1930s, but early work on an effective antibiotic has started. Up until this time, bacterial infections will just kill you. There's no good way to stop a bacterial infection. Just making sure that you are healthy, so your own body may be able to fight it. But there are certain bacterial infections that we're going to I can't remember what it's called now. But work begins there. Slowly, there's advancements in surgery. We're starting to understand hygiene and sanitizing, surgical instruments, understanding the microbial world, right? So, what's under the microscope and how does that kill us or how does that make us sick? So there's some advancements there. There's some surgical techniques that are coming along. Anesthesia. So one of the things that really affected surgical procedures is the fact that, you cut into somebody, they're going to feel it. There wasn't good ways to knock somebody out and be able to perform a surgery on them. So now we have anesthesia that's coming along. And one of the big advancements because of World War I is plastic surgery, reconstructive surgery. So there was a lot of young men coming back from World War I who were disfigured by a shell or a bullet or something else. And there was new advancements as far as reconstructing faces or applying prosthetic limbs, things like that. And I should also mention the bombing and the shelling of World War I was so off and on, just the frequency was so high that they still find unexploded shells particularly in France every once in a while. And they'll have to call out like a bomb squad to come pick it up and make sure it's inert. It's not going to go off. But yeah, they still find shells over a century later that didn't detonate. But anyway, moving forward. So reconstructive surgery. There's better ways to save a limb now. Remember, during Civil War, you get shot in the arm, you're almost guaranteed to lose that arm. That's the only way to save your life, was to get rid of the arm. Now, a little more advanced, there's better ways to save a life. But that's going to continue and get, and we'll see more sort of medical revolution as we get into the 30s, 40s, 50s. Cultural movements. Now, this is happening around the world. So it's not just in America. Jazz is huge in France and different places. But, music is starting to reach more people. Blues and jazz, because of things like radio, because of things like, the phonograph, more records are out there. And women are now enjoying more freedom. So partly due to the 19th Amendment and this guarantee of the right to vote, it's a liberating time for women. And one of the ways that they sort of express their individuality and their freedoms is with this sort of cultural movement called the flappers, which is the ladies in the image there. So you could see they're showing off like all their leg up to the knee. which was unheard of up until the 1920s. Nobody was doing that. They drove cars and they drank alcohol and they smoked. They did all these things that men did. So it was sort of this gender revolution that was going on, and they were out there. They were being seen. And especially among young women, enjoying their lives alongside of young men. And that was the sort of movement there in the 1920s. Interesting enough, another issue that was occurring at this time was prohibition. So even though everybody seemed to be enjoying themselves through the 1920s, prohibition had outlawed the sale of alcohol in January 1919. And this was something else that we've mentioned here and there, the idea of prohibition. So dating back into the 1800s, there was this idea that alcohol was sort of one of the roots of evil in the United States. And if we could simply outlaw it, make it illegal, we would solve all of our issues or solve a fair number of issues. And this movement finally was popular enough in the late 1910s to get an amendment passed. Now remember, the amendments have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So across the land, you had enough of sort of a conservative idea when it came to alcohol to get it outlawed. You could not produce alcohol in the United States unless it was for like a medical purpose or industrial use, but for consumption, none. Which gave rise to what we call the speakeasy in the 1920s, where you might find a flapper dancing and having a drink. So did it work? No, absolutely. It just drove alcohol consumption underground. There was plenty of speakeasies around the country. There was plenty of places to get alcohol. And it also gave rise at the time to organized crime. So guys like Al Capone, who made money in basically becoming bootleggers, making illegal alcohol. This was the rise in the Appalachians of moonshiners. It's where we get NASCAR from. That was the idea. These guys in the South were making moonshine and running from the cops. So they had these hot rod cars that they had all juiced up to be able to outrun the cops. And that is the roots of NASCAR, because then they took their hot rod cars, they started racing against each other. So yeah, and that's another issue. Instead of keeping it legal where you could regulate it, it drove this business underground. So then you didn't have any way to regulate it. You couldn't really keep a close eye on what was happening. And that gave rise to these different, sort of mob groups that were in control. And then, of course, they start getting their hands into other illegal activities as well. But through the 20s, things were going pretty good for the United States. There was lots of progress. The economy was just going gangbusters. We had a cultural revolution. So everything was looking up, and we had solved all our problems in Europe. So that, I believe, is where we will stop. And we'll pick up with the Great Depression, which is going to be the exact opposite of the Roaring '20s, which we'll talk about tomorrow. So any questions there on World War I or the 1920s? All right, I'm going to say that's a no. Just a few key points here. Things that can appear on your social studies exam. In particular, women's suffrage is a popular topic on the social studies test. World War I is a popular topic on the social studies test. So particularly over the next week or so, really a lot of things that could possibly come up as part of what you may be reading. So you want to make sure you have that background. I will also put up some definitions for things like nationalism, nation, and state on Google Classroom, so you'll have that available. And then down the road, I'll try to make like a whole kind of comprehensive. Every time we have a class and I add slides, I'm putting those slides on Google Classroom. So you'll have a set of slides also to review for some of that information. Okay, so let's go ahead, take a break. We're going to work on pronouns and language arts. So let's go to about 1:35 for our break, and I'll see you guys back here for language arts. All right, bye.